Denial. A troublesome word, especially when it comes to denying the Holocaust. But there's a new kind of denial running rampant in the world today. Denial of the murderous massacres and rampage of rape perpetrated against innocent Jewish Israelis on October 7th, 2023. And while October 7th is a different kind of Holocaust than what transpired during the dark years of World War II, the denial is the same animal. I'm an academic and a professor at a major American university. It is not my intent to make any political statements, even though many of my colleagues at schools across the country are doing just that. In my position, it's important to address a phenomenon that goes back decades to the very end of the Second World War, namely Holocaust denial. But to add an important addendum, because after the horrific atrocities perpetrated on October 7th, a new form of denial has raised its head, even among elite institutions of higher learning. It needs to be isolated, understood, studied, and countered. What actually happened on that day, that Black Sabbath? It was a holy day, given over to celebration and abundant joy, especially in the land of Israel. A holiday called Simchat Torah, which literally means rejoicing over the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. This year, it fell on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. Religiously observant Jews had been celebrating late into the previous night, dancing in the streets and carrying aloft handwritten scrolls of the holy books. Those of a more secular bent found other ways to celebrate. Not far from the border of a coastal strip known as Gaza, a different kind of jubilation was taking place. The Supernova weekend-long outdoor trance music festival began on October 6th. Thousands of music and arts fans had gathered for this celebration of life, music, and peace. On the following morning, October 7th, the celebration of life was turned into a macabre spectacle of death. Suddenly and without warning, at 6:30 a.m. local time, barrages of rockets were launched from Gaza into southern Israel, as far north as Tel Aviv. The Palestinian terrorist group, Hamas, carefully coordinated the attacks, firing thousands of rockets at different times and from different angles, attempting to overwhelm Israel's missile defense system, the Iron Dome. Simultaneously, thousands of armed terrorists in body armor and armed with AK-47s broke through the security fences on motorcycles and in pickup trucks, invading Israel proper. Other terrorists on motorized paragliders with assault rifles in hand joined the murderous melee. When they came upon the throngs of young people encamped at the Nova Music Festival, they unleashed sheer carnage, swiftly surrounding the site and cutting down those who were running away, fleeing for their lives. Along the road, the terrorists ambushed car after car, shooting the occupants who were huddling in fear and throwing grenades into each one. Some 364 people lost their lives during that festival of peace. Another 44 were taken hostage at this one location. It was one of the most gruesome concert attacks ever perpetrated. But don't tell that to the throngs of anti-Israel protesters across the United States and in major Western capitals.
Some sort of rave or desert party where they were having a great time until the resistance came in electrified hang gliders and took at least several dozen hipsters.
These were not atrocities, and these were not peaceful concert goers. These were settler colonialists, fully complicit in the oppression of the people of Gaza.
Festival goers are not innocent civilians, they are settlers.
So they deserved it?
Yes!
And this is the new incarnation of Holocaust denial. Of course, the bloodshed at the concert was only one of multiple incidents transpiring that day. Well over 1,000 terrorists overran multiple Israeli towns, communities, and communal farms known as kibbutzim to the north and east of Gaza. In kibbutz Kfar Aza, the terrorists unleashed a bloody rampage on Jewish families in their homes. Acting methodically and with advanced planning, the terrorists on paragliders began landing by the dozens, surrounding the settlement and sealing its outer perimeter. They were supported by snipers who took up positions on the high ground, while an additional Hamas platoon penetrated further into Israeli territory, setting up ambushes along the roads leading to the settlement. They planted anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in case Israeli forces should arrive. They even carried medical kits, including morphine for their own wounded. Once inside the kibbutz, they went from one house to the next, systematically murdering entire families, mutilating bodies and kidnapping others. In addition to AK-47s, they carried rocket-propelled grenades and incendiary grenades for burning down houses. And they made sure to bring flex cuffs for kidnapping. They even carried large butcher knives for murder on a more personal level. It was later confirmed that many of the terrorists had been using a hallucinogenic amphetamine called Captagon to put them in the right frame of mind. Tires were taken from cars, set on fire, and thrown into houses, killing everyone inside. As soon as the alarms went off that morning, most of the inhabitants immediately fled to their safe room, shelter present in every house in case of rocket attack. But the terrorists sprayed the safe rooms with rifle fire or threw in grenades, while the burning tires filled the houses with smoke. Such carnage continued throughout the day as other Gazans arrived on the scene to scavenge each house for loot, trampling on the bodies of the victims. At least 52 of the 800 residents were murdered, while 13 were reported missing. 7 or more others who were not killed were taken hostage to Gaza. Did these atrocities actually happen? Not according to a good many of those marching in the streets and taking over university campuses. Welcome to the new Holocaust denial. At the border town of Sderot, which for many years had been subject to sporadic rocket fire from Hamas, another troop of armed terrorists overran the police station and barricaded themselves inside. When Israeli forces later arrived, fierce gun battles erupted, continuing for several hours. Finally, the IDF demolished the building with a combination of tank fire and a military wheel loader. The terrorists were killed, but only after murdering 35 officers, staff members, and civilians. At kibbutz Nir Oz, over 100 residents, 1/4 of the population, were either slaughtered, taken captive to Gaza, or declared missing. At kibbutz Nir Am, 25 were murdered, and at least 80 reported missing. Any mention of these atrocities by the protesters? Any sympathy for the victims? Any acknowledgement that there were victims? Yet another target was kibbutz Be'eri, which was attacked by some 70 Hamas terrorists. They slaughtered at least 130 residents, 10% of the kibbutz, including women, children, and at least one baby. The Reuters news agency put together an extensive account of the attack, documenting minute by minute the scope of the atrocities. More than 20 kibbutz residents were interviewed in an attempt to reconstruct the timeline of terror. Many had barricaded themselves in their safe rooms while those outside heroically battled the attackers. It took many hours before the Israel Defense Force arrived and regained control of the area. 9 first responders and soldiers were among those interviewed by Reuters. They related seeing corpses of several victims handcuffed and shot in the head. The body of a murdered woman whose trousers were pulled down around her ankles was witnessed by the commander of Israel's Volunteer Community Emergency Response Group, Zaka. For days, the remains of burned-out vehicles could be seen scattered across the kibbutz. The walls and floors of houses were covered with blood, many having been charred with fire. Those hiding in their safe rooms themselves became victims as the terrorists shot through the doors with their automatic weapons. At least 42 homes, almost a quarter of the residential structures of the community, were severely damaged. The eyewitness accounts of what happened that day correlate well with findings presented by Israeli military officials. They're backed up by captured video revealing execution and the mutilation of bodies. But when it comes to propaganda, proof hardly matters. When confronted with the scale of what happened, Hamas fell back on a tactic used for decades by anti-Semites in the aftermath of the Nazi Holocaust: deny. To be sure, when Reuters questioned a Hamas official in Lebanon, Osama Hamdan, about the carnage at Kibbutz Be'eri, he responded with a total and utter denial of all the Israeli claims mentioned in this report. Looking at October 7th as a whole, there were many unique aspects of this murderous rampage, but perhaps the most striking is that the perpetrators were actually proud of the savage acts they were carrying out. Even the Nazis tried to cover up their crimes and hide the evidence as best they could. Not these killers. They documented their carnage using GoPro cameras attached to their helmets. One young Hamas murderer phoned his father while the raid was ongoing, bragging that he had personally killed 10 Jews. He even sent photos of his victims to his parents. Others were posting evidence of their atrocities on their social media accounts as they were engaged in the slaughter. No effort was made to spare those who posed no threat, and an eagerness to kill was nearly matched by an eagerness to disfigure the bodies of the victims. In several clips, the Hamas killers fire shots into the heads of people who are already dead. They count corpses, taking their time, and then shoot them again. It must be said that even the notorious SS murderers did not openly brag about their genocidal actions. In the modern world, there have, of course, been other genocides, including Rwanda, Cambodia, Guatemala, and Armenia. But rarely has such carnage been carried out with such fervor and in so short a period of time. Moreover, the specter of Holocaust denial, launched in the wake of World War II, has not gone away. It has morphed into what is today excused as anti-Zionism, but is in reality plain anti-Semitism. Back in Israel, a traumatized nation had to deal with the daunting task of burying the victims. In Jewish culture, there is, of course, the utmost respect not only for the living, but for the dead. The body must be washed and completely clean, down to the nails, with no jewelry or wounds left unattended. The body is then dressed in beautiful, clean linens and wrapped for burial. But after October 7th and the wholesale slaughter of some 1,200 Israelis, the members of Zaka literally had their hands full attending to corpses. There were multiple gunshot wounds, multiple stab wounds. One victim was a grandfather whose hands were tied behind him as he was shot in the face. According to Jewish law, every drop of blood must be buried with the body, and collecting the blood was in itself a Herculean task. Many of the victims had been decapitated and their bodies found headless. In many cases, the legs had also been severed. When heads were found, it was often difficult to know which head went with which body. DNA analysis had to be employed even to establish the identity of many of the victims. Other bodies were gruesomely charred, with only bone structures still remaining. In many cases, it was clear that the victims had been burned alive in sheer agony, having been found in fetal positions. Some had been tied up and burned together. Pathologists also found soot in the lungs, indicating that the victims were still breathing as they were being burned. In some of the most horrifying instances, there was nothing left but ashes, which had to be buried respectfully, somehow clumping them together in the shape of a body. Even more shocking is the fact that some of these clusters of ashes clearly belonged to babies. Many were burned inside their houses, and archaeologists had to be brought in to determine which ashes belonged to humans and which to the house. Even DNA analysis proved ineffective in such instances. Any jewelry on the female bodies had also been looted as a final act of scorn. Asher Moskowitz of the United Hatzalah First Responder Group published a video of himself claiming that he saw the remains of a baby who had been baked to death in an oven. One first responder recounted in detail exactly what he saw when he came upon the scene.
Going to clean up, to pick up the terrorists, it was like all of the houses in the back were the field over there. And there was one terrorist body over there. And we went, and just right next to him was a body of this 14, 15-year-old. Head chopped off. We were looking around for the head. Couldn't find it. I first came into that place. I saw they were hugging. They were trying to escape and to defend themselves. The terrorists were having a ball, eating the food that was on the over there that was prepared for the holiday.
The head of Israel's volunteer EMS squad, Eli Be'er, made a similar claim, saying Hamas terrorists cut an unborn baby from a mother, stabbed it, and put it in an oven.
Well, they took every human being they could. They didn't find these babies. They took other babies. They chopped off their heads. They burned the babies. We saw burned babies there. Little tiny babies. They had one child actually hugging a bear when he was burned. He was wrapping his hands on a bear, and the bear was stuck to him. You couldn't even recognize if it was a real, it was unrecognizable. We didn't even know what's the head. They were literally burned, that we had to figure out what it is. It was a baby that was holding a bear. That's what it was. And they had dozens of babies like this, children that were murdered in front of their mothers. They actually murdered children in front of their mothers. They took Holocaust survivors and they tortured them. And then they murdered part of them. They kidnapped old people. They kidnapped women. They raped women in the party. They found girls that were dancing minutes before. They caught them and they used them many, many times to rape them, and then they killed them. This is the worst type of massacre you could ever imagine. This is not even terrorism. This is another level of ISIS. ISIS was probably a lot more humane than they were.
Not surprisingly, the internet instantly came alive with debunkers, charging that there is no physical evidence for such claims. In the same way that Holocaust deniers claim it is impossible to prove that 6 million Jews were murdered and that large numbers were cremated. Indeed, the list of Holocaust revisionists goes back almost to the end of the war itself. In 1948 in France, the first work of Holocaust denial was published by Paul Racinier, entitled Crossing the Line. In 1977, he went on to publish Debunking the Genocide Myth. He alleged that the Holocaust was a Zionist swindle meant to extract millions of marks from the Germans. He argued that the testimony of the survivors was untrustworthy and exaggerated. In the US, there was Austin J. App, who in 1965 published The 6 Million Swindle. Former professor of English at LaSalle College in Philadelphia and at the University of Scranton, he claimed that only 1.5 million Jews lost their lives as partisans or spies. He also argued that the Nazis had no plan to kill all the Jewish people. They only wanted the Jews to emigrate. And this was no different from many other countries who expelled Jews in the past. As for the claim of 6 million Jews killed, he declared that the burden of proof rests on the accusers. Basically, he says, prove it. Again in the US, we have Arthur Butts, a professor of electrical engineering at Northwestern University, who insisted that Zyklon B gas was used at the camps, but only as a disinfectant and insecticide. He gives the impression of being a serious scholar, but goes on to blame the Zionist International, the communists, the US government, the OSS, and others for fabricating a genocide that never happened. Over in Britain, there's David Irving, a military historian who has published over 20 books since 1965. A self-described moderate fascist, Irving is one of the most dangerous individuals involved in Holocaust denial, being familiar with historical evidence and how to bend it to conform to his own ideology. In 1988, American Fred Leuchter published a report claiming that 32 samples of concrete and brick from the so-called gas chambers at Auschwitz had been analyzed by DuPont laboratories, showing no trace of poison gas. As for the 6 million who were murdered, when there's nothing left but ashes, how can you attach a number to them? Moreover, if you can't completely disprove the mass murder of Jews and other targeted groups at the hands of the Nazis, you can claim that such numbers can't be proved either. You can claim that the death toll was exaggerated and ultimately no different than the carnage caused by the Allies in their prosecution of the war, which involved the indiscriminate bombing of German cities and the death, dislocation, and even starvation of millions of civilians. Returning to October 7th, we know that of the 1,200 fatalities, some 880 were civilians. And for those who survived, the scars will never fade. Some 20 small children lost both of their parents. 90 children lost one parent. And 40 18 to 25-year-olds lost both of their parents. It was without question the worst single attack on the Jewish people since the Nazi Holocaust. It shouldn't surprise us that what followed was a continuation of Holocaust denial. This new Holocaust denial isn't exactly the same as before, but it's not different either. When we look at the depth of depravity unleashed against Israel, it's clear that this new denial is in some sense even worse than its predecessor, for it amounts to projecting the atrocities of Hamas onto their Jewish victims, who were, after all, settler colonialists, and who subsequently unleashed genocide on the Gazans. Obviously, the very mention of ashes and the looting of valuables reminds us of Auschwitz and the other Nazi murder factories. Indeed, the Nazis gassed their victims and cremated the bodies. Israeli General Itai Veruf, who led the counterattack, drew many parallels with the Nazi death camps. But just as deniers came forth in the wake of World War II, declaring that charges of Nazi genocide were nothing but a fabrication, there was, almost immediately after October 7th, a concerted effort by Hamas sympathizers throughout the world, and especially in the West, to deny that this contemporary Holocaust ever happened. Such atrocities never took place at all, so it's claimed. The IDF must have staged everything. It was they who raped Israeli women while pretending to be Hamas infiltrators. In 1993, historian and Emory University professor Deborah Lipstadt wrote a classic volume entitled Denying the Holocaust. Today, however, it would be fitting to add a new chapter, because the phenomenon of which she writes may be properly categorized as a shapeshifter. It can appear on the right and on the left. It can appear not only as Holocaust denial, but October 7th denial. It can appear as anti-Semitism and as anti-Zionism. It can even appear as anti-colonialism. And it needs to be the subject of serious scholarly research, as well as grassroots efforts to combat it. Let's look at some of the forms this new Holocaust denial takes. We've seen, for example, the anti-Israel encampment movement at multiple colleges and universities, some of them elite Ivy League schools. Demonstrators demanded that these institutions thoroughly divest from any commercial dealings with the State of Israel. The protests were not only loud, not only disruptive, but violent. Of course, no mention was made of Hamas atrocities, no mention of mass murder, maiming, mutilation, rape, and torture, no mention of abduction, no mention of hostages. One journalist for the French paper Le Monde reported that he had toured Kfar Aza after the attack but saw no beheaded babies, an atrocity which had been widely reported, and nothing to confirm it. He concluded that the story was improbable. More than half a year after the Hamas murder spree, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey found that most Palestinians believe that the October 7 attack was the correct decision and that Hamas did not commit war crimes on that day. They admit that Hamas attacked, but they deny that atrocities were perpetrated. Bassam Youssef, Egyptian-American comedian, television host, and surgeon, not surprisingly, took issue with the charge that Hamas terrorists had murdered babies. He declared that there was only one baby killed. Only one? If it's only one, does that make it not so bad? The truth is, there was one Israeli journalist who had reported that as many as 40 babies had been killed, and some beheaded. International media reported it as 40 babies beheaded. In reality, no one in Israel ever made this claim, though it is well established that roughly 40 babies were indeed murdered. Prime Minister Netanyahu posted on X that he had personally seen a photo of at least one baby beheaded and another baby burned, and this was independently verified by the United States. There is even video of a Hamas terrorist in Israeli captivity admitting that he perpetrated rape. Yet Bassam Youssef laughs off the allegations of gang rape and sexual violence. This is Holocaust denial 2.0. Of course, there's the matter of sexual violence. In the documentary film entitled Screams Before Silence, the former COO of Meta and founder of LeanIn.org, Sheryl Sandberg, interviews multiple eyewitnesses, released hostages, first responders, medical and forensic experts, and survivors of the Hamas massacres.
זה הבית שלנו, גולדשטיין אלמוג. בית שבנינו לפני 4.5 שנים, עברנו אליו. המקום הפרטי שלנו, המקום הבטוח שלנו, המקום שמאוד אהבנו.
Oh, this is horrible. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. No one should have to live through this. Okay? I'm trying to be okay. You don't have to be okay. You have to be okay. No one could be okay. Yes.
Freed hostage Amit Susana recalled her harrowing kidnapping from Kibbutz Kfar Aza on October 7th and being forced to perform sexual acts on the man guarding her in Gaza.
That was the first thing I feared. Being raped. Being sexually assaulted.
Now remember the entire time I was like thinking, okay, you knew it's gonna happen. It's really happening.
it's really difficult to talk about. But it's my calling, it's my duty to come out and talk.
Her account was consistent with what she had told professionals immediately upon her release after 55 days in captivity. And she confirmed what other freed hostages, massacre survivors, family members, and forensic experts had long said. Sexual violence, including rape and mutilation, had in fact taken place on October 7th, and those abducted into Gaza continued to be subjected to sexual assaults. Yet many months after October 7th, and long after Susanna became the first to come forward about the abuses she suffered, accounts of sexual violence continued to be doubted or worse. This despite mounting evidence that Hamas has used sexual assault as a weapon of war, and a UN report that found reasonable grounds to back the allegations. Most discouraging is that despite the indisputable evidence, these atrocities have received little scrutiny from human rights groups and international organizations. Many leading figures in politics, academia, and media have attempted to minimize or even deny that they occurred. Progressive New York Congressman Jamal Bowman made remarks to pro-Palestinian protesters just days after House members were shown video of the atrocities, calling reports of Hamas terrorists raping Israeli women propaganda. He said in a TikTok post, "There is still no evidence of beheaded babies or raped women, but they still keep using that lie for propaganda." Bowman later apologized, saying, "Immediately when the United Nations provided additional evidence, I voted to condemn the sexual violence." But the episode demonstrates just how deeply the denial narrative is embedded in a good swath of the general culture. And the denial goes on, so that the victims of genocide, the Jewish people, who seek only to survive in their tiny state, are increasingly cast as perpetrators of genocide.
All the filthy, disgusting lies that the Israelis told after October the 7th.
Like what?
About burning babies and women being raped, which were all complete...
Actually, women were raped.
No, they weren't.
Yes, they were.
Well, there's no evidence.
It's been established by the United Nations.
You can say anything that you want, but there's no evidence.
Actually, there is extensive evidence.
There is no evidence.
Sexual assault and rape. Well, there is.
Okay, well...
But when it comes to what really defines genocide, the determining factor cannot be the number of people who suffer. War is hell, and all wars, including just wars, produce suffering. Genocide can only be judged by the intent of the perpetrators. There is no question that Nazi policy, as dictated by Hitler himself, was to exterminate every Jew in Europe, and if the day ever came when the Third Reich ruled the entire world, to kill every last Jew on earth. Is there any question that the Hamas murderers would in fact have murdered every last Jew in Israel if they were able, and if they had not been stopped by Israeli military force on that terrible day? But if there is any note of optimism in all of this, it is well expressed by British journalist Douglas Murray, who made the following comments. The Jewish state and the Jewish people have survived an awful lot worse than this. They have seen off every single one of their enemies, from Pharaoh to the Assyrians to the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, and they will see off Hamas. To that I would add that in spite of Holocaust upon Holocaust, in spite of denial and deniers of Holocaust, the Jewish people yet live, and they are not going anywhere.